this week there's been the meeting of the Premier League clubs. With the Chelsea situation, the Premier League was looking like it was going to take a vote to prevent the Chelsea loophole from happening again, but now they've abandoned that after lack of support. I mean, it seems quite obvious on the face of it, but maybe people don't understand why would clubs want to keep that avenue open for themselves?
Well, they've just screwed the whole thing up. I mean, this was known about. I first tweeted about this theory around the women's team in about maybe April of 24. It was 2.5 months before they actually went ahead and did it. And before they actually did it, it was put to a vote last year. For some reason, they couldn't find the right drafting for the clause. Now, all they needed to do on the drafting of that prohibited deals like the women's team was to say you can't do anything that would be disregarded in the calculation for UEFA. So we just copy that. Or we copy the wording from the EFL. Because already, most of the league anyway, so half the league anyway, is already trying to comply with the UEFA rules. So just copy whatever they do in terms of these sorts of arrangements. And they exclude them from the calculation. So that's all they needed to do. So the idea that you couldn't possibly come up with the drafting is nonsense. Anyway, they didn't get it through last year. But once you've not got it through last year and then Chelsea have done what they've done in terms of doing the deal, then of course nobody's going to support it this year. Why would you support it this year? The only team that might support it this year would be Chelsea, to close the door on everybody else doing it because they've done it. So, you just got to question some of the judgment around one, not bringing it straight back last year, or finding a form of words that they knew would get the vote through. And two, the judgment to say, well, we won't bring it back at all season, and we'll bring it back at the end of the year. But then we won't do the drafting, we won't do the lobbying beforehand to make sure that it even gets to a vote. None of that makes, that is not the way it should work. And so, look, the reality is if you've got that rule that allows all the major clubs to effectively move the women's team from one bit of the business to another, then PSR is basically dead. We know that it was probably dead anyway because of the change to the squad cost control and the other things that look like the UEFA rules that are coming in, apparently, maybe at some point. So we know it was already dead, but it's completely dead if you can just bypass the whole thing by an intra-group transfer at very, very substantial value. Because, make no mistake, Chelsea might be worth, a provable, i.e. what it can get approval for, whether it is worth that or not. Anybody can have their own view on what it's worth. But a value that the Premier League will approve. We know that that's going to be 200 million plus now because they've got their third party to come in and buy a minority, right? So if that's 200, then you can go right down the league. Any major club has got a women's franchise that's worth, let's say, 100 million quid plus. 100 to 200 million. Everybody. Because why not? Because it's not valued on. It's valued all on future value. It's all It's all valued on what the women's game might be worth in 25 years. So it doesn't matter whether right now you're doing 3 million quid of revenue because the top team are only doing 6 to 10. So it's irrelevant. So all of these clubs have got on the Chelsea basis, and the trophies are irrelevant. People say, oh yeah, Chelsea have won all these trophies. If you're valuing women's football on a 25-year basis, i.e. what it's going to be worth in 2050, the fact that Chelsea have won a few trophies in the early formative years of the WSL is irrelevant. And because all of the value is forward-looking. And the value of the kind of franchise, for want of a better word, is in the IP of the intellectual property of the actual club. So that means that Everton's women's team is worth 100 million quid on this basis. 125 million quid because it's figure in the air stuff, and maybe more. maybe 200 million. I don't know. Why is it worth any less than Chelsea? Because it's all about what it's going to be worth in 25 years' time. And anyway, the point is that everybody's now got a women's team that's worth a lot of money on the Chelsea basis, and everybody's now been told that if they need to for PSR, they can move it within the group effectively without penalty, and therefore they've just created another massive additional buffer in PSR. And how any club now could fail PSR is beyond me, because I just don't understand why you wouldn't just move the women's team. Now, the only thing you can say on the flip side of it is if Chelsea are right and women's football does explode and the value does go to $1 billion, all of the value of that increase in value goes not to Chelsea men's team or to Chelsea men's football club, goes to a separate entity over here owned by Clearlake Bowley and the new investor, and they get all the upside. So if they're right, the actual big losers here are the Chelsea men's team or Chelsea men's club, because they're going to see none of that benefit. They've sold it now. They've sold it very early. So that's the kind of paradox of this whole situation, is actually if Chelsea are right and women's football does explode, then Chelsea men's are going to be a massive disadvantage to all the men's teams that held on to their women's teams.
Absolutely. And then, sticking with another aspect of PSR, The Athletic reported that Chelsea could make £300 million of pre-tax losses and not breach PSR for 2024-25. Does that seem right with you?
Well, obviously, very few people understand what that article actually says and what that table means, so it's caused a bit of excitement around. I mean, I'm just looking at my numbers now in terms of what I think. So I've got them on my model for 23-24 being around about, before the sale of the hotel and before the sale of the women's team, I had about 170 million short. So we know the hotel was 76.5, so that left them around about, on my model, about 95 million short. Okay. Now, when you add those back in, let's have a look. I mean, they will get the 200. We know that. Yeah, I mean, I think they can lose. I'm not sure it's 300, but I think they can lose a lot. And that's, that's just the nature of doing £275 million of these funny intra-group transfers. I mean, so it's not a sign of, the business being well run. They're still going to lose, on my model, they're still going to lose 250 million quid at operating losses. It's going to take them to $1 billion over the last 4 years, before player sales and before these funny intra-group transfers. Okay, so because obviously this season they'll have more match day than last season. They'll have a higher domestic finish. They'll have European football. We know that's probably anyway. They're probably going to do around about the same revenue as they did last year, even without a shirt sponsor. Okay, so they did 468 last year. They'll do about the same this year. Okay, but the problem is they've got massive player amortization, and they've still got massive wages, and that's even if they've managed to reduce the wages. And if everything that they say is true about wages, then they always talk about these heavily incentivized contracts. Okay, So one of the justifications that they've had for why their wage bill has come down, and it's only come down modestly, but why it's come down modestly is because it's all heavily incentivised. Well, some of the things that would have given them the triggers for the incentivisation have happened. So they qualified for the Champions League, they won a trophy, so therefore you would anticipate that they've triggered some of that incentivisation, and therefore you would expect there to be some, if it's true that they've got heavy incentivisation, you would expect there to be some fairly hefty bonuses being paid for the current season. So anyway, top and bottom of it, do I think that before player sales and before sort of funny property sales, they can lose 300 million? It won't be far off that. Yeah, I mean they can lose a lot, because there's just the nature of sticking in a lot of the funny transactions. You know, so I had them exactly on 105 for 24-25, but after you put in the sale of the women's team, and you know, I think they'll do another. They've got Gallagher already in as profit sales. Gallagher's already in for 24-25. So they're going to be fine for PSR. I mean, that's the bottom line. They're going to be fine, and they will lose a fortune. And at the, you know, in terms of what the club costs, but it's kind of irrelevant because they've had these exceptional internal sales, which obviously is going to make them fine for PSR. If you add another £276 million of allowances into any team, they're not going to fail PSR. I mean, the point is that if they hadn't have sold £275 million worth of assets, then clearly they'd have failed PSR by a mile.